All right, this is Generous Theology. I'm Brock, and I'm with my friend Chuck. We have an exciting time tonight. Well, as exciting as talking about prolegomena can be, Chuck. It is a joy to be talking with you here at this time. You and I have been working through Volume 1 in Professor Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics, and this is the volume on prolegomena, which means first things. We are in Chapter 7, the scientific foundations for dogmatic principles. And Chuck, we've talked about the theological prolegomena. We've talked about the foundations of thought. We've gotten into the two sections. Bavinck writes here about rationalism and empiricism. In this next section called realism, Professor Bavinck talks about three different topics, each of which represent perhaps, let's say, a classic or a seminal take on the subjects that it is dealing with. So in this section on realism, we have one section about natural certainty. And when it comes to talking about the setup for why Christians believe what they do, one of the great challenges of modernity has been around this topic of certainty. And then finally, the priority of the senses. There's a section in there where Bavinck really talks about what is going on, what's actually happening when the human is philosophizing, for lack of a better word, when we actually are thinking, when we actually are trying to put things together in our minds about reality. What's going on as best as we can tell. And then the third section there is universals. I think all three of these sections are deep and have something very substantive to say. You and I were discussing before we started recording, and I mentioned to you that I thought this section here on realism with the three subsections could be and perhaps should be a graduate level course at a Christian university in terms of setting worldview. And I think, Chuck, there's this idea that Professor Bavinck's talked about what are the foundations, and the two pillars that he examines relate to the classic expressions of rationalism and empiricism. And we talked about this arch of St. Louis as being this helpful model where the human mind meets at the top of the arch, and one pillar of the arch goes down and represents an empirical approach, and one pillar goes down to the other side and represents a rationalistic approach. And it's in this realism and in these topics that we find we have to meet, we have to synthesize. Something has to happen where brute facts, let's say, have to turn into meaning. And so that has to happen, Chuck. For us to make meaningful statements, we have to talk about what meaning is in the first place. And I thought Professor Bavinck here did a great job for that. So that's a high-level overview. Let me just throw it over to you. What were your expectations when you were coming to these sections? What were your ideas about what you were hoping Professor Bavinck would cover? And how deep down the rabbit hole were you comfortable going with the text that he gave us?
Yeah, there's no doubt that there's depth here, and there's a level of difficulty, and so it took a little bit of work to get through it, but it was pleasant work, to say the least. And what I would say is this, so this chapter began with the discussion of rationalism and empiricism, and then leads to realism. And there's a sense in which, in some ways, that could almost seem misleading, that somehow realism is something different than empiricism or than rationalism. Rather, that's not really so much the case as it is perhaps a reframing that takes into account much of rationalism and maybe even some things from empiricism, although I think it really leans a little more to the rationalist side of that arch, but then does so in a somewhat different way, and in a way that I really appreciated. For example, just even that first sentence in the section on realism, the starting point of the theory of knowledge ought to be ordinary daily experience, the universal and natural certainty of human beings concerning the objectivity and truth of their knowledge. I think that's an important statement, and it is not automatic to either rationalism or empiricism for that very daily experience to take primacy. And yet I think there's something that to me is just really important about beginning with that. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is it reflects our humanness. It reflects who we are as human beings. And as Christians, we say we're created in the image of God. So there is something special about being human, about being made in the image of God that's different than other creatures. And therefore, if to some extent the way we think about things begins with that ordinary human experience, I think it says something religiously about who we are and why our humanity is important. So right away, that initial statement was just really meaningful to me. And then I tied it in. Again, I'm no expert on philosophy. I've been reading this stuff with you and really learning a lot, and that includes long before we started recording these conversations. And perhaps I have some level of knowledge that I didn't have even a few years ago. But in thinking about that initial statement, as I reflected on that statement, two things came to mind about other things that we've read or that we've talked about. One is the philosophy of Herman Dooyeweerd, who, as you know, even though I haven't spent a lot of time with philosophy, a lot of the philosophy that I learned in college was based on Dooyeweerd's writings. And certainly the college that I attended, Dooyeweerd's philosophy was really key to understanding the worldview, the reformed world and life view that in the way that Dordt University really tries to frame things. And the reason that statement brought Dooyeweerd, who comes a number of years after Bavinck, to mind is, as we learned in just doing a little bit of a review of Dooyeweerd when we read the Creative Thinkers book a number of years ago, Dooyeweerd talks about the importance of what he calls naive knowledge. And that naive knowledge sounds like he's almost putting it down, but he's not. What he's really saying is ordinary, daily, things that we understand and know, not because we've spent a whole lot of time philosophizing about things, not because we've spent a whole lot of time observing and experimenting, not because we've spent a whole lot of time sort of rationalizing, beginning from, certain, ways of thinking and drawing out conclusions from there, but rather, the importance of just that everyday knowledge that we as humans have. And then secondly, it also reflected a little bit to me. We had talked as well in some of our reading in 19th century philosophy about Reid, the realist philosopher. Can't remember his first name, but Reid. And I know that Alvin Plantinga, again, a Christian philosopher of much more recent vintage. In fact, he's still, even though he's retired, I think he's still doing some writing, and also comes from the tradition that I'm part of. Plantinga is often known as building off of this realism of Reid, and then moving from that to warranted true belief, and a lot of other things that Plantinga talks about. But again, it seems to be based in this idea of that realism has that you need to start with ordinary daily experience and build from there. Now, I suspect that Plantinga, as well as Dooyeweerd, were impacted by Bavinck. Dooyeweerd probably very directly. I'm going to guess he read Bavinck in the original Dutch. Plantinga, I believe, also reads Dutch. I believe he studied at the Free University in the Netherlands as well, as I recall. But even outside of that, likely, in his upbringing in probably World War II and post-World War II era Christian Reformed Church, even though probably a lot of that was done in the English language, certainly Bavinck had an impact because most of the people who taught him likely did read in Dutch and were heavily impacted by people like Bavinck. I don't know. For all I know, Plantinga could read Dutch even as a young man. That I don't know. But so it does seem to me that, again, as I read this chapter, I upon reflection, I felt like what I was seeing is the seed beginning to germinate as it began then to bud in Dooyeweerd and flower in Plantinga. And while, again, I'm no expert in these folks, these are folks that I have, grown to appreciate, but also have been taught to appreciate as well. Which it's always good when the things that you're taught as a younger person line with as you grow in greater knowledge those things seem to be aligning. So that's good too. So there's really a sense in which reading this section, even in the more difficult parts, even in the parts that were a little bit more of difficult work to understand and to get through, there was always this sense that I knew I would have a handle to grab on. I knew that at the very least I had some level of I don't know, trust is, I don't know if that's the right word, but some level that I knew this is stuff I could grab on. And there was just enough that was both familiar and as well as just seemed to hit the right points. And I admit, given my own worldview, there's always a little worry about confirmation bias, but given what I had learned before, and given my predilection to really appreciate people who come from the tradition, from that Reformed tradition, and especially from that Dutch Reformed tradition that I grew up in, there was almost a sense in which like I hadn't walked very far from home.
Chuck, that's a beautiful opening and introduction. Thank you for that. I think I'm so stirred by Professor Bavinck's words here. One of the sentences that just hit me like a ton of bricks was this. Bavinck says at the beginning of paragraph 67, one must first live, then philosophize. And here's his idea. Now he's thinking about Tertullian when he says this. And Tertullian has this idea. First, there was the man, and then the philosopher or the poet. Now, Chuck, we're talking about starting. And in starting, you cannot start somewhere and then go to a place where you then start again. And so the very first sentence in this section says this: the starting point of the theory of knowledge ought to be ordinary daily experience, the universal and natural certainty of human beings concerning the objectivity and truth of their knowledge. In other words, Chuck, philosophy is the fruit of cognition. It's not the root. And any philosophy that would reverse that order, that would change up the world, so to speak, has to be rejected. And there's a beautiful way that Bavinck talks about this. He says it is not philosophy that creates the cognitive faculty and cognition. He says philosophy only finds it and then attempts to explain it. And so philosophy can never create something. It can only explain the thing that is there. And so Bavinck continues, any solution that does not explain the cognitive faculty, but instead destroys it or turns it into illusion, is judged by that fact. And Chuck, that's a great starting point. That's an anchor in the ground. I live at the beach. And, Chuck, when we're trying to talk about bootstrapping theories of knowledge, it's a helpful thing to me to think about how people in my region build houses at the beach. As you know, beaches are often very sandy, and sand does not a great foundation make. And so if you wish to build a beach house, then you need a strategy to bring stability out of the natural instability of the sandy location. And so, in other words, you come to the beach as it is, and as an engineer, you must plan and design and construct a building that will work in that environment. You do not get to come with your cosmic eraser and erase the sandy beach out and then just re-edit and reanimate a nice firm foundation for your beach house. Chuck, this is the opposite, of course, for how it works in, let's just say, for example, I'm a video game designer or an editor, and I'm creating worlds for people to play in. Well, when I design a level or when I design a map or when I design a world, I am in that business of world building. And so the person who lives in my world will function under the rules that I set. And so if I create a virtual reality where the sky is green, well, then the people who inhabit that reality are going to have to deal with it. The one thing they cannot do is they cannot come into the game, as it were, and change the parameters that I've set up. And so Bavinck here, in a sense, is building out on this creature-creator distinction that is so well beloved within Reformed theology. And that's the idea that the creator is prior to the creature. And as such, the creature, by virtue of his existence, inherits constraints. Chuck, there are constraints upon me. There are constraints upon you. We live in a world where I physically do not have the capacity or capability in the normal course of jumping. I can't jump 70 feet straight vertically in the air. If I could, Chuck, and I was the only one who could do it, the basketball teams would be after me. But it's not something I can do. It's the same thing here with when it comes to running. Human beings at this stage cannot run a 1 minute mile. And Chuck, I fare much worse than most of those human beings in that regard. I cannot run a 1 minute mile. There are capacities that are beyond me. There are constraints that I inherit, and that there are rules to a game. If I want to use a Wittgensteinian approach here, there are constraints that come that philosophy can never move around. And so when we run into philosophical systems that seek to do this very thing, we have to, Bavinck says, we have to reject them. We have to understand that there are limits to the philosophical faculties. And so with that in mind, we're in a position to start building from this starting point. Now, Chuck, let me bounce those ideas off of you. And what are some of the things that come into your mind or that hit you when you hear those categories talked about?
Yeah, so first of all, just to echo a couple of things that you've already brought in, is that creator-creature distinction. And that is it really is a key to understanding the Christian worldview. And it's not unique in that there aren't other worldviews that make that distinction, but it is beginning to become more and more unique in that I think at least modern Western thinking really is moving away from that creator-creature distinction. And that's super important, and so the fact that what Bavinck is saying here really points to that is just really key. I think another key piece of this is just, there's somewhat of the commonsensical about this idea. And Bavinck says this. He says at the end of that first paragraph, every human, after all, accepts the reliability of the senses and the existence of the external world, not by a logical inference from the effect, in this case, the representation in his consciousness, to the cause outside of himself, nor by reasoning from the resistance his will encounters to an objective reality that generates this resistance. Prior to all reflection and reasoning, everyone is, in fact, fully assured of the real existence of the world. And let's be honest, that is a true statement. And as much as those who would try to reject those ideas, and there are those who do, much as they would, try to put those aside and say, no, that we can't necessarily rely on the reliability of merely the senses and the existence of the external world. We can't just sort of make assumptions about and predeterminations about what's going on around us. The fact is, we do. And even the most resistant philosopher to these kinds of things is still going to live his or her life anticipating that gravity will continue to exist, will continue to live their life assuming that atoms will bond in the same way that they do now, the various rules of thermodynamics will continue to exist. And even beyond that, that there are certain ways that people relate to each other. They're not just going to go out and, I'm unhappy with this person, so I'll murder them. That just, unless there's severe mental illness going on, that just doesn't happen. Because there is an understanding that there is a realness to the world. And there's a realness not just to what we see. It's not that these are merely images, but it really goes beyond that. There's a realness even to those things that you can't see, how people relate to each other. For example, a realness to things like emotion and belief and faith. And as much as folks try to deny that, realistically, that's how we live our lives. And, just make the argument, well, that's only for this little limited area of life. We can separate our sort of philosophizing from that. It just doesn't work. The more we try to rate things and say, well, this is for this area, this is for this area, this is for something else. It's interesting that that's done often by folks who are still trying to build a grand unified theory of everything. And there is a sense in which, trying to deny that reality just isn't how we live. So that's really another piece of all of this that I just found really, really helpful. And then finally, and we may get a little bit more into this, so I hope I'm not jumping too far ahead, but it's still in the natural certainty section here anyway. There was also, I think, in what Bavinck was writing, I really appreciated how he expressed the unity of the human being, right? The intellect is bound to the body and thus to the cosmos, and therefore cannot become active except by and on the basis of the senses. But beyond merely talking about the senses here, what he's doing is he's pointing out, that our intellect, our capacity to think, our capacity to rationalize, our capacity to understand, those are important things, but they're still tied to the reality, the physical reality of the world. And my pastor was just preaching on this again this Sunday about how important it was. He was talking about the work of Christ and Christ coming into the world and preparing not only to die, to physically die on the cross, but also then talking about how he broke the bread and he poured the wine and said, "The cup of my blood," and how so much of what Christ said to his disciples was entirely built on reality, on the stuff of life. The fact that we have we use water for baptism, and we use bread and wine or grape juice for communion, and that these sacraments are so tied to these physical things here on earth is a reminder of how much we are physical beings. We were created in the garden. We were created to work in the earth. The new heavens and the new earth aren't some place out in La La Land where we'll just be floating spirits, but there's really talk of the new earth, and there's talk of the garden and the city in the new earth, and we are physical beings. That's how God created us. And to ignore all of that is problematic. And even some Christians tend to go in that direction. So again, I really had a great appreciation for Bavinck's willingness to tie, to make a unity of ourselves. Yes, we are thinking beings. Yes, we do exercise our intellect. Yes, we do rationalize through things. We're able to, create rational arguments out of thoughts. But all of that is still tied to the physical world. Not in the way that empiricism is, which says nothing exists except for what you can physically touch and see and smell, but rather that it's all part of a unity. So that was also just another piece of this section that I just really, really appreciated.
Yeah. Thank you for building that out, Chuck. I agree. I think reading in that same section that you were citing from, Bavinck builds on this in a really important way. Bavinck says every human, even the least knowledgeable, a child already, and an animal also, accepts in advance, without any reasoning, the existence of an external world. In the mental representation, therefore, there must be an element that points directly back to reality. And I love how you were building that out. Now, Chuck, there's a funny joke that I grew up with, and perhaps you have as well. And it was the joke or the canard that there are two kinds of people in this world: people who A, and then people who B. So that's the format of the joke, and you would hear variations of the joke. There are two kinds of people in the world. There are people who are Steelers fans, and then there's people who are not, and or there are people who love pizza and people who don't, or people who dress well and people who don't. However however it was that you wanted to partition things. But from this idea that Bavinck believes, and I certainly can't disagree with him, this starting point. Now, let's hold on for a minute. For somebody who wants to say, what about all of the other schools of philosophy that start from other starting points? Well, that's a great question. I think to do it justice would probably be a graduate level symposium. But let's point out that philosophical systems that seek to create a worldview, an understanding of reality, that start from positions other than the starting point Professor Bavinck is giving here, I think we can put a label, we can put a name on those. We can call such schools irrationalistic. That is to say, they wish to start from a starting point other than this, and presumably they're going to have their reasons. Now, Chuck, I don't think we're going to be able to, of course, I'm not an irrationalist under this definition, so I don't believe irrationalists are going to be able to maintain that. But I think at the very least, we want to recognize, Chuck, that we're talking about starting. And just because we start in one place does not mean that that's the only place or the only thing that we ever deal about or think about. And so one thing that happens when this initial starting point is considered in modern times, some people have taken a starting point like this and have, well, let me just read Bavinck. Bavinck says this: in modern times, many people have accepted the position of phenomenalism or absolute idealism and consider the world of perceptions and representations the only true world. Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Merrily, 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 merrily. Life is but a dream. And so, Chuck, the unique challenge of the modern is to want to take that starting point that Professor Bavinck has talked about, and from that starting point, move forward in a phenomenal sense, using the methods of critical thinking and science. And so this is where we see the birth of the modern humanities, of the modern liberal arts, of what we've called the Geisteswissenschaften in previous lectures. And this comes out of the movements, the idealistic movements of the 19th century over in Germany, the continental thinking, as it were, Kant, Hegel, Schleiermacher, Schelling, Fichte, Strauss, Marx. And so one place where people can move forward from this starting point is the idea that self is the center. Self is the center. And so all things are to be measured, dealt with, and understood in relation to self. And there are good things about that, Chuck, thinking modestly, but there are also some grave difficulties with making the self the center of the universe. Now, did you see that shift? We were talking just a moment ago about starting point, and then we made the shift into from the idea of starting with self to this centrality of self. Now, I want to read a chapter from Augustine, and this is from his Confessions. This is chapter 2. I would not exist unless I were in you. And Augustine says here, and how can I call on my God, my Lord and my God? When I call on him, do I not invite him to come into me? But what place is there in me where my God can enter? Is there any room within that can receive the God who made heaven and earth? Is there any room within me, Lord, that is fit to hold you? Can even heaven and earth, which you have made, and in which I exist, in any way contain you? So, Chuck, this brings up the modern dilemma. And what is the modern dilemma? Well, the modern man, constrained by this phenomenalism, this idea of the starting point of self as a philosophical method, the modern man then looks inside of himself and says, I see no God. And from that starting point, the modern man continues to look. His starting point is a godless starting point centered on self. And will he ever find the God of this universe? And in fact, that's the justification that many modern skeptics and atheists give. They say, I started with myself, and I started with the tools of science and critical thinking, And I kept looking and I kept building and I kept trying to find the divine. And he was nowhere to be found. And so, Chuck, I think Professor Bavinck helps us understand that our starting point, even though we have to start with these basics and with these givens, even our starting point is prone to falling into this phenomenalism. And we have to ask the question, how can we, from our starting point, get from point A to point B? Now, Chuck, we're still exploring and developing the landscape, so I'm not looking to answer that question particularly here tonight. Though, of course, I believe the Bible gives us the answer, and that is that God himself bridges the gap. God himself makes the thing happen in the minds of the human being. Calvin said this, every person has within himself an understanding of self and an intuitive understanding or sense of God, this divinus sensitatus, this divine sense. And while we're not saying that we have five senses plus this divine sense that Calvin speaks of, what we're saying, Chuck, is that in addition to these five senses, there is a God outside of us who lives and works and moves and acts. And so that things that come into our knowledge, into our being, into our understanding, are never void of or bereft of that divine aid. And Chuck, I think Bavinck just shines here in considering this foundational element. What does it mean to you that God himself is the guarantor of this situation, as Professor Bavinck describes it?
Yeah, what's really neat about that and the way that you put that is that in many ways we are, in working through Bavinck's theses, in thinking about this idea of realism, we are able then, in seeing God as the guarantor, in many ways we're able to build a philosophy that takes into account a God outside of us. And perhaps it's best said that we're not necessarily building that philosophy, but because it's been given to us in some way through the intellect that we've been granted. But it's just really it's very different than what we see in the standard modern, whether it's the modern rationalism or whether it's the modern empiricism. Having God as the guarantor in many ways answers a lot of those difficult questions about where does our perception come from? What is reality? Is it merely images, on a cave wall, or what if there are things that truly exist that are more than just images, then what are these other things that we can't touch and are more metaphysical? And it answers a lot of those questions, even not perfectly and not in a way that means we can just, here's the answer and we're never going to think about it again. But it even gets into some of the issues of evil in the world. I've been thinking about this a little bit because I've been engaging not particularly heavily on these philosophical or theological issues, but somewhat, with a couple of friends, one of whom I don't know was ever a Christian, another of whom certainly was, even not that long ago, has been trumpeting their freedom from religion in the last little bit. And there's a sense in which, it's more than just a sense, those folks, those two people specifically, have as the basis for their reasoning for rejecting Christianity, rejecting religion as a whole, have really pointed to the evil in the world. But in pointing to the evil in the world, there is a sense in which, again, if we in some way sort of blame God for evil in the world, to some extent we are also then bringing God back into our level, that God is a creature in the world rather than something outside of it. And evil becomes a permanent function rather than something that in the wholeness of time has already been defeated and will, even though we live in time and aren't able to see the full defeat yet at this moment, we, at least as Christians, we understand that whole system is complete. The work of Christ is complete, and evil has been defeated. And again, having God as a guarantor, as having God as beyond creation, really, I think, helps in dealing with a lot of those sticky issues. And again, I wouldn't want to say that, we've found the solution, we don't need to talk about it any further, because it's still, I was talking to our youth group last night. And one of the things that we did last night, and we'll probably continue to do on an occasional basis, is I had the pastor in as well, and we just said, hey, why don't you guys, you guys probably have questions that you never feel like you get to ask. It feels like maybe they're questions you're not allowed to ask, or questions that if you ask them, people might think that you're somehow not a Christian or you're doubting. And we said, no, this is going to be a free time to ask those kind of questions. What do you want to know? And one of the students asked, why is there the devil? Why does the devil exist? And you could hear in that question and in some of the discussion, that was even, in the mind of 15 and 15-year-olds, thinking about this problem of evil, perhaps not at a level that we're discussing here, but at a level that is really to these young folks. And in my experience has become very, very important to all sorts of people. And again, there's a sense to me here. And while there's a depth to it that I feel like I cannot yet plumb, there is also a sense that a lot of those answers, there's a path to those answers in this philosophy that Bavinck is presenting. And in a lot of ways that just, even in places where I don't intellectually fully grasp all of the arguments and all of the issues, there is a sense in which I get some comfort out of the idea that, it seems to be going in a direction that provides a warrant for our faith. And that's just, there's something comforting. How about for you? Are there some things in this discussion that just, in some way really, grabbed you in a way that just made you thankful for some of the things that we're reading here?
Yeah, I thought that Professor Bavinck is worth studying here, because every person who thinks about the landscape Professor Bavinck paints will be edified by having a scene in their mind in which all of the major pieces are in their right place. And I think that's the ultimate issue when it comes to meaning, isn't it? The granddaddy of all problems in philosophy occur in fights not over necessarily what is, but rather what is means. And so, starting from Professor Bavinck's picture, I think we can bootstrap this Christian construction, this orientation that Christians testify we receive from the Bible. There is a starting point. The starting point is our natural, ordinary experience. It's not simply about self, though it includes that as a starting point. It also includes our being in a universe that is populated and that has certain realness to it that is independent of the mind, already existing. So, Chuck, when I was born, I came into a universe that already existed. I do not create that universe. The universe created me, in fact, would be the distinction there. And this really goes against a lot of many modern minimalistic type schools of thought. And so I appreciate that. Now, we've started from this starting point. What do we crave? Well, if you start walking somewhere, the last thing you want to do is fall off of your path and fall into a ditch or fall into error, fall into something that is not tenable, that is wrong. And so to do that, your knowledge, your theory of knowledge has to undergo growth as a result of the stimulation that you receive by being in this universe. So, Chuck, we came into this world as children, and as children, from the immediacy of our experience, coupled with the providential hand of God guiding, we started to experience things. We experienced a mother's love. We experienced a father's joy. We experienced family life, being accepted, being loved, being wanted. We accepted being in a particular place. We accepted that we were a certain part of the world and that we were not other parts of the world. We accepted that we were ourselves, but that other people in our lives also had their own selves. We accept this, what Bavinck calls this natural certainty concerning the reliability of the senses and the reality of the external world. Now, this natural certainty, this is important, is not a scientific certainty. It's not a demonstrative certainty, but it's rather the certainty that is a grant or a gift from God. Now, there are reformers in Calvinistic theology who make statements like the existence of God is necessary because without him, there would be no existence to be had. Now, that can be understood in cartoonish and ill-considered ways. The idea here is when you really do look at some of the other competing theories for why reality is the way that it is, you run into some almost insurmountable, if not insurmountable, issue right away. And let me take this. First of all, an issue of design. Chuck, the way they used to make film is motion pictures would be made up of a sequence of images projected, and each of the images would have a delta or a slight difference from the other images, the image that had come immediately before it, as well as the image that comes immediately after it. And so the way you would see a film in a theater is that images would go through this projector at a rate of, I think it was 24 frames per second, and would be projected onto the screen. And so our eyes would perceive motion, and we would perceive the world of that movie being projected onto the movie screen. Now, what's the thing to notice about the film itself in this older model? Well, we notice that the film retains a large consistency throughout it. Now, not every single frame is identical to every other frame, but it's also the case that most frames are greatly related to the frame immediately before it and the frame immediately after it. There is this continuity of meaning. Now, imagine we are in a universe where there is no continuity, where one moment the law of contradiction holds, and then another moment it doesn't. And then at one moment, the universe appears to be old to our eyes. And then another moment later, it does not appear to be old to our eyes, but it appears young. Now imagine another moment where I think of myself as being a human with a head, a torso, 2 arms, and 2 legs, one moment, but then I go to sleep and I wake up the next morning and I am like Franz Kafka's protagonist in The Metamorphosis. I wake up a bug. We see that there is this great integrity in reality. There is not a uniformity, but there is this very obvious purpose. There is this very obvious move. Things develop in ways that cannot be explained in terms of purposelessness, in terms of only random factors coexisting. And so this idea builds upon this. Not only do we live as a self in this universe, but we live in this universe where there are great guides. There are guiding principles. There are principles of purpose. Heat flows from hot to cold. The atomic number of elements does not change on a whim every other day. You know, there's lots of uniformity, if not a complete uniformity, in the reality that we live in. Now, that's coming at it from one side. Now, of course, Chuck, from the other side, there are elements of change. You know, we've talked, you and I, about the fight in Greek sophistry between Parmenides, the eternalist, and Heraclitus, the situationalist, the eternal person, the eternal thinker who said you never step in the same river twice. We're not solving all of that here. But the point is these preconditions that we get from this Christian construction make further inquiry possible. And so when we start throwing out ideas, so let's say, for example, Chuck, you come to me and you say, well, I'm a skeptic. I do not believe there is purpose in the universe. I believe the universe is simply random events, random actions happening through time and through space. And there is no other explanation, not only needed, but possible to explain what's going on here. We run right into this fact that there is so much from the ordinary experience that refutes that it is simply not tenable from the starting points that we have. And Chuck, in some sense, I wonder if that explains the fascination some of the irrationalistic schools have with those other starting points. Now, we didn't get far in this realism section. We didn't talk particularly about the priority of the senses. We didn't talk about the issues associated with universals. So I think we've got some more discussion here. But But Chuck, I wanted to throw it over to you maybe for some final thoughts on that aspect of it, and this idea that inquiry itself only really works under the situations that are given to us in a Christian construction. What do you think?
Yeah, I have to agree with you. And to some extent, I think Bavinck builds on that even further in the next few sections in his discussion of universals and how universals relates to reality. And so I'm not going to dive too much into that because that might start another 30 to 45-minute discussion here. But yes, absolutely. And what's really neat is that, yeah, we've gotten through just a few pages, if that, and yet there's so much more here that to discuss. And it's just, yeah, as you said at the outset, in some ways, just this section, just these 5 or 6 pages, could be a graduate level course at a Christian university, and maybe it ought to be. There's so much we could get into, but on the other hand, even as it is deep, it is also wide. There is a sense in which this Bavinck's discussion here touches on so much of human experience, so much of what it means to be human, to be made in the image of God, to live in a world, to be able to think, to be able to perceive, to be able to think rationally about things, to be able to, discover things through our senses, all of that. All of these big issues are touched upon by the discussion here that Bavinck has, and yeah, I'm even though it may seem like we haven't gotten real far, we just did a couple of pages here. There is also a sense in which there's a reason for that. This is deep stuff, but it's also broad stuff, and there's just so much here to appreciate. And in the end, about all I can say is, man, thank God for Herman Bavinck. And it's not just because Bavinck was great in and of himself, but because of the gifts that God gave to him, and then as well as the gifts that God has given to us, you and I, in our discussions, and others who may be listening to us, to be able to understand and think about these things. It's really a gift. It's a gift to be able to think through these things. It's a gift to be able to have Bavinck in a form where we can read him. It's a gift to have this opportunity. You and I are 1,000 miles apart, and yet we can have these discussions. And I'm just thankful that we're able to do that. Thanks to God, and thank you to you, Brock, as well, for allowing me to be part of these discussions. It's really a blessing.